Chapter 19: A Macroeconomic Theory of the Open Economy. In this chapter, we answer the following questions. In an open economy, what determines real interest rate, the real exchange rate? How are the markets for loanable funds and foreign currency exchange connected? How do government budget deficits affect the exchange rate and trade balance? How do other policies or events affect interest rate, exchange rate, and trade balance? Theory of the open economy. These are the assumptions that we're making. Economy's GDP is given. Real GDP is determined by factors of production and available technology. Economy's price level is given, and that price level adjusts to bring the supply and demand for money into balance. The model we're using, these are the highlights. The model highlights the forces that determine the economy's trade balance and exchange rate, looking simultaneously at two related markets: the market for loanable funds, the market for foreign currency exchange. The market for loanable funds. In an open economy, S for savings equals investment plus NCO. Savings equals domestic investment plus net capital outflow. Market for loanable funds. Supply of loanable funds, that is from the national savings. Demand for loanable funds from domestic investment I and net capital outflow NCO. Net outflow of capital when NCO is positive, that is net purchases of capital overseas, adds to the demand for domestically generated loanable funds. Net inflow of capital is when NCO is negative or less than zero. That is, capital resources coming from abroad reduce the demand for domestically generated loanable funds. How NCO depends on real interest rate. This is a graph of net capital outflow interest rate on the vertical axis, NCO on the horizontal axis. The real interest rate R is the real return on domestic assets. A fall in R from R1 to R2 makes domestic assets less attractive relative to foreign assets. People in the US purchase more foreign assets. People abroad purchase fewer US assets. Therefore, NCO rises from NCO 1 to NCO 2. Market for loanable funds. We bring together demand, which is domestic investment plus NCO, and upsloping supply, which is national savings. Both I and NCO depend negatively on R. That's why it is downward sloping. So the demand curve is downward sloping. R, or interest, adjusts to balance supply and demand for loanable funds. Example 1. Budget deficits and capital flows. Suppose the government runs a budget deficit. Previously, the budget was balanced. Use the appropriate diagrams to determine the effects on the real interest rate and net capital outflow. Solution: here we got two graphs side by side, the loanable funds market and net capital outflow. the interest as balanced demand and supply. A budget deficit reduces savings and the supply of loanable funds, causing a rise in interest rates. And that is what you see as a left shift of S1 to S2, and interest rate goes from R1 to R2. And that is reflected on the net capital outflow graph. The higher R, or interest, makes US bonds more attractive relative to foreign bonds, and that reduces NCO. So NCO shift goes towards the left. When working with this model, keep in mind the loanable funds market determines interest. Interest is determined in this graph. Then this value of R determines NCO in the right graph. So once interest is determined here, it is reflected on the second graph. Foreign currency exchange market. The market for foreign currency exchange involves trade US dollars in exchange for foreign currencies. It's an identity because NCO is equal to NX, we saw in the last chapter. NX, or net export, is the demand for dollars. Foreigners need dollars to buy US net exports. NCO is the supply of dollars. US residents sell dollars to obtain the foreign currency they need to buy foreign assets. The US real exchange rate, uppercase E, it measures the quantity of foreign goods and services that trade for 1 unit of US goods and services. E is the real value of a dollar in the market for foreign currency exchange. E balances the supply and demand in the market for foreign currency exchange. The market for foreign currency, E, is on the vertical axis and dollars is on the horizontal axis. An increase in E makes US goods more expensive to foreigners and reduce the quantity of dollars demanded to buy those goods. An increase in E is the same as appreciation of the dollar or the dollar getting stronger. An increase in E has no effect on S or I, so it does not affect NCO or the supply of dollars. So the supply curve or the NCO is vertical. E adjusts to balance supply and demand for dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange. Example 2a, supply or demand. Shemar, a US resident and business owner, buys cars made in Germany. How is this transaction affecting supply or demand in the foreign exchange market? Two views. One, the supply of dollars increases. Shemar needs to sell dollars to obtain the foreign currency he needs to buy the imports. Two, the demand for dollars decrease. The increase in imports reduce NX, which we think of as the demand for dollars. So NX is really the net demand for dollars. Both views are equivalent. For our purposes, it is more convenient to use the second. 2b, demand or supply. Alexandra, a French business owner, buys wine made in US for her French restaurants. How is this transaction affecting supply or demand in the foreign exchange market? Two views. One, the demand for dollars increases. The foreigner needs dollars in order to purchase the US asset. Two, the supply of dollars falls. The transaction reduces NCO, which we think of as the supply of dollars. So NCO is really the net supply of dollars. Both views are equivalent. We will use the second one. Active learning one. Budget deficits again. Initially, the government budget is balanced and trade is balanced. That is, NX is equal to 0. Suppose the government runs a budget deficit. As we saw earlier, R rises and NCO falls. How does the budget deficit affect the US real exchange rate? The balance of trade. Let's look at the answer. Market for foreign exchange, there is a downsloping demand for dollars or net exports, and the vertical supply of NCO, and the equilibrium is at E1. The budget deficit reduces NCO and the supply of dollars, shifting S to the left. The real exchange rate appreciates, reducing net exports. Exchange rate goes from E1 to E2. The dollar appreciates. Since NX is equal to 0 initially, that is trade balance, the budget deficit causes a trade deficit. NCO becomes negative. This diagram shows twin deficits since 1960, how US budget deficit is related to US net exports. Net exports and the budget deficit often move in opposite directions. The effect of a budget deficit. The effect of a budget deficit, national savings falls, the real interest rate rises, domestic investment and net capital outflow both fall, the real exchange rate appreciates, that is, E increases, net exports falls, or the trade deficit increases. On one other effect, as foreigners acquire more domestic assets, the country's debt to the rest of the world increases. Due to many years of budget and trade deficits, the US is now the world's largest debtor nation. International investment positions of the US as of September 30th, 2019. The value of US owned foreign assets is 28.01 trillion. The value of foreign owned US assets is 38.56 trillion. US net debt to the rest of the world is 10.56 trillion. The connection between interest rate and exchange rate. Two graphs, NCO and the dollar graph. Anything that increases interest rate, R goes from R1 to R2, will reduce NCO, moving NCO to the left from 1 to 2. And the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market, the NCO will shift to the left in the dollar market. The result, the real exchange rate appreciates from E1 to E2. Keep in mind, the loanable funds market not shown determines R. This R is determined in the loanable funds market. The R determines NCO shown in upper graph. This NCO determines the supply of dollars in foreign exchange market in the lower graph. Active learning 2. Investment incentives. Suppose the government provides new tax incentives to encourage investment. Use the appropriate diagrams to determine how this policy would affect A. Real exchange rate R, B. Net capital outflow NCO, C. Real exchange rate E, and D. Net export NX. Answers to A and B. This loanable funds market is at a balance at R1 and the net capital outflow. Investment and the demand for loanable funds increases at each value of R. That means there's a right shift of the demand for investment dollars. R rises, causing NCO to fall. So R goes from R1 to R2, and that will cause NCO to fall from 1 to 2. Answers C and D. The fall in NCO reduces the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market, which means NCO shifts left. The real exchange rate appreciates. That means E moves from E1 to E2, and that reducing net exports. Effects of investment incentives. A tax incentive for investment has a similar effect as a budget deficit. That is, interest rises and NCO falls, exchange rate rises and NX falls. But one important difference: the investment tax incentive increases investment, which increases productivity growth and living standards in the long run. Budget deficit reduces investment, which reduces productivity growth and living standards. Ask the experts. Deficits. If the United States reduces its fiscal deficit, then its trade deficit would also shrink. What do economists say? 57% agree, 37% uncertain, 6% disagree. Trade policy. This is government policy that directly influences quantity of goods and services a country imports or exports. They include tariff, a tax on imported goods, import quota, limit on the quantity of imports. Some arguments for restricting trade: save jobs in domestic industry, reduce trade deficit. Example 3, protecting domestic auto market. Suppose the government uses import quotas on cars imported from Japan in order to protect jobs in the domestic auto industry. Use the appropriate diagrams to determine how this policy would affect R. By A, the real interest rate R, the net capital outflow NCO, the real exchange rate E, the net exports NX. Does the policy saves US jobs? So the two diagrams, loanable funds diagram, net capital outflow. An import quota does not affect saving or investment, so it does not affect NCO. Recall that NCO is equal to S minus I. So, market for foreign currency exchange. Since NCO is unchanged, S curve does not shift, so NCO still remains the same. The D curve shifts at each E imports of cars fall, so net exports rise. D shifts to the right. At E1, there is excess demand in the foreign exchange market. E rises to restore equilibrium. Solution D. What happens to NX? Nothing. If E could remain at E1, NX would rise and the quantity of dollars demanded would rise. But the import quota does not affect NCO. So the quantity of dollars supplied is fixed. Since NX must equal NCO, E must rise enough to keep NX at its original level. Hence, the policy of restricting imports does not reduce the trade deficit. Solution E. Does the policy save jobs? The quota reduces imports of Japanese autos. US consumers buy more US autos. US automakers hire more workers to produce these extra cars. So the policy saves jobs in the US auto industry. But E rises, reducing foreign demand for US exports. Export industries contract, exporting firms lay off workers. This import quota saves jobs in the auto industry but destroys jobs in US export industries. Political instability and capital flight. In 1994, political instability in Mexico made world financial markets nervous. People worried about the safety of Mexican assets they owned. People sold many of those assets, pulled their capital out of Mexico. Capital flight is defined as large and sudden reduction in the demand for assets located in a country. Capital flight in Mexico. This is loanable funds in Mexico, and this is net capital flow. As foreign investors sell their assets and pull out their capital, NCO increases at each value of R, that is, NCO shifts to the right. Demand for loanable funds, that is, I plus NCO. The increase in NCO increases demand for loanable funds, so demand shifts to the right from D1 to D2. The equilibrium value of R and NCO both increase. So interest rate goes from R1 to R2. The increase in NCO causes an increase in the supply of pesos in the foreign exchange market, shifting NCO from 1 to 2. Lowering exchange rate from E1 to E2, the real exchange rate value of the peso falls. Examples of capital flight: Mexico in 1994, South Korea, that is Southeast Asia in 1997, capital flight. That was South Korea, Thai, Indonesia, Russia in 1998, capital flight. Argentina in 2002, capital flight. Ask the experts. Currency manipulation. Economic analysis can identify whether countries are using their exchange rates to benefit their own people at the expense of their trading partners' welfare. What do economists say? 30% agree, 36% are uncertain, 34% disagree. Case study: capital flows from China. China accumulated foreign in assets, including US assets, from 2000 to 2014, increased from 160 billion to 4 trillion, including US government bonds. But from 2016 to 2018, China's reserves of foreign assets fell by almost 1 trillion. Results in US appreciation of the dollar relative to Chinese renminbi, higher US imports from China, larger US trade deficits. The inflow of capital reduced US interest rates, increasing investment in the US economy. Think per share. Hong Kong has a capitalistic economic system. It was leased from China by Great Britain for 100 years. In 1997, it was returned to China, at the time a more socialistic country. Number A, what do you think this event did to the next capital outflow of Hong Kong in the years immediately following 1997, and why? In the years immediately following 1997, the residents of Hong Kong chose Canada as a place to move some of their business activity. What impact do you suppose this had on the value of the Canadian interest rate and exchange rate, and why? Number C, which Canadian industries, those engaged in importing or exporting, were pleased with Hong Kong's investment in Canada, and why? Number D, what impact did Hong Kong's return to China have on the growth rate of Canada in the years immediately following 1997? Chapter in a nutshell. Market for loanable funds. Real interest rate adjust to balance supply of loanable funds from national saving and the demand for loanable funds for domestic investment and net capital outflow. Market for foreign currency exchange. Real exchange rate adjusts to balance supply of dollars from net capital outflow and demand for dollars, that is net exports. Connecting them, net capital outflow contributes to the demand for loanable funds and also provides the supply of dollars for foreign currency exchange. A policy that reduces national savings, such as government budget deficit, reduces the supply of loanable funds and drives up the interest rate. It causes net capital outflow to decline, reducing supply of dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange. The dollar appreciates and net export falls. Political instability can lead to capital flight, which tends to increase interest rate and causes the currency to depreciate. Although restrictive trade policies such as tariffs or quotas on imports are sometimes advocated as a way to alter the trade balance, they do not necessarily have that effect. A trade restriction increases net exports for any given exchange rate and, therefore, increases the demand for dollars in the market for foreign currency exchange. As a result, the dollar appreciates, making domestic goods more expensive relative to foreign goods. This appreciation of offset the initial impact of the trade restriction on net exports.